Okay, let's unpack this. In the 21st century, we are constantly processing information, opinions, demands, feelings. I mean, it's just constant.
An overload.
A total overload. We're essentially cognitive superprocessors, just, trying to keep pace with the world that seems to accelerate every single year. The sheer volume of emotional and informational input that you need just to get through a single workday can feel, well, overwhelming. So what do? Instinctively,
We look for shortcuts.
exactly. We look for mental shortcuts. We build these quick frames of reference just to make some sense of the chaos.
And if you feel like you're drowning in all those inputs, the most valuable skill you can master isn't about speeding up your processing. It's about fundamentally changing how you interpret the inputs themselves. And today, we are doing a deep dive into that remarkable human capability, the profound flexibility of the mind through the lens of cognitive reframing.
And this isn't just, some feel-good mindset talk.
No, not at all. This is a defined, powerful psychological technique that has been proven to reshape reality.
So, at its core, cognitive reframing is about what? Identifying a situation, an experience, maybe an idea or an emotion that's causing you distress or limiting you,
Right.
and then actively, deliberately changing the way you view it.
It's a systematic process. It's about challenging those initial, sometimes automatic thoughts and swapping them out for something more adaptive or more positive or even just more objective.
It's like hitting the debug button on your own internal emotional algorithm.
But that's a great way to put it. And that transformation, that systematic challenging and changing, that's what gives this concept its tremendous power. However, and this happens a lot in behavioral science, the terminology has gotten incredibly convoluted.
Murky.
Very murky. So our mission today is to cut through that noise. We're going to trace the origins of this concept back to the foundational days of cognitive therapy. We'll explore its powerful therapeutic uses, including some surprising connections to memory function and even humor. And most importantly for you, the learner, we have to clarify the often confused distinctions between cognitive reframing, cognitive restructuring, and the cognitive distortion that these techniques are designed to fix in the first place.
Because you need to know precisely which mental tool you're holding when you decide to shift your perspective.
Exactly.
All right, let's start at the beginning then. Let's build that foundation. We've defined cognitive reframing as this sort of general, overarching process of challenging and then changing how you view a situation.
Right, the big picture.
But when you take this idea out of general life philosophy and you apply it rigorously, say, in a therapeutic setting, the process gets a more formal, more specific name: cognitive restructuring.
And that relationship is crucial. Reframing is the macro skill, the big umbrella. Restructuring is the micro, specialized application of that skill.
So to understand that specialized application, we have to go back in time a bit.
We do. We have to go back to the 1960s and the revolutionary work of Aaron T. Beck, who is really seen as the pioneer of cognitive therapy.
And at that time, the thinking around mental illness, especially depression, was what? Very psychoanalytic.
Oh, deeply entrenched in it.
Yeah.
The focus was all on excavating deep, historical, often unconscious drives and traumas.
So therapy was this very long-term, intensive process. You were basically digging around in the past for hidden meanings, like archaeology for the mind.
Exactly, archaeology for the mind. But Beck, while working with his patients who were diagnosed with depression, he noticed something immediate, something happening in the present.
Okay.
He saw this persistent, foundational pattern right there in their conscious thoughts. It wasn't just that these patients felt sad, it was that they were constantly generating what he termed negative automatic thoughts, or NATs.
Negative automatic thoughts.
And these thought patterns were relentless. They would loop, they would persist, and they seemed completely impervious to external reality or any logical argument you could make.
That must have been a huge revelation. I mean, Beck basically shifted the entire focus of treatment from this deep historical trauma excavation to debugging the patient's real-time operating system.
He did. What was the core of his method?
Well, his genius really lay in two steps. First, he helped patients recognize the immediate, profound, and often destructive impact of these ingrained, automatic, negative thoughts, the things we'll later call cognitive distortions.
So just seeing them for what they were?
Yes, that recognition was step one. Then, once that was established, the work became aiding them in systematically challenging those thoughts and shifting their mindset. It was not about just telling a patient, hey, be happier.
No. It was an active, systematic, intellectual exercise.
So it was about proving to the patient through real-world data and logic that the thought they were having wasn't necessarily true. They had to actually test the thought.
Precisely. They were encouraged to view their thoughts as hypotheses, not as facts. And this systematic process, where the patient was able to lessen or sometimes completely eliminate their depression by successfully challenging and replacing these negative thoughts with more balanced, more adaptive ones, well, that was the birth of the therapeutic application we now call cognitive restructuring.
And it was revolutionary. It gave the patient immediate, tangible tools to change their state right now instead of waiting years for some historical insight.
And the sources mentioned that Albert Ellis, who was another giant in the field working on rational motive behavior therapy, or RDBT, he and his peers were also instrumental in formalizing this technique around the same time.
They were. They formalized this precise method and they gave it its name, unequivocally. Cognitive restructuring. So when we use that specific term, we are talking about that clinical structured process.
The deliberate rethinking of perceived negative thoughts.
And successfully transforming them into positive, rational, and adaptive thoughts. So restructuring, in its original sense, was a tool aimed specifically at positive psychological strengthening.
But the story as a concept doesn't just end there in the clinic. As so often happens in psychology, researchers started to see the same pattern that was uncovered in a clinical setting, happening everywhere else.
Spontaneous.
Constantly, in everyday life. They realized this fundamental shift in perspective doesn't need a therapist's office or a formal diagnosis to happen.
And that realization is the key differentiating point, isn't it? It's what leads us to the modern vocabulary.
It is. Cognitive restructuring remained the precise clinical term for that therapeutic, positive, systematic transformation. But to describe the more generalized process, the spontaneous, non-clinical, everyday mechanism of simply changing one's mental perspective, regardless of the direction the term cognitive reframing was developed.
Ah, okay. So reframing became the umbrella term. It captures everything from a momentary, spontaneous shift in attitude, like deciding the rain means you have an excuse to curl up with a book, all the way to a profound, non-clinical life transformation.
And it doesn't matter if that shift was intentionally positive or, unintentionally negative, it's still reframing.
Right. Beck and Ellis gave us the foundation. The empirical proof that thoughts can be systematically changed to dramatically improve mental health.
And then subsequent researchers gave us the generalized vocabulary to understand that this cognitive power, it extends far beyond clinical depression. It influences every split-second decision, every emotional reaction, every long-term goal in our daily lives.
So it's a universal human mechanism, not just a clinical tool.
Absolutely.
So once we grasp that reframing is this broad, universal process, we can start to see just how useful it is for a massive range of challenges. Its core benefit is its ability to help people cope with inherently difficult circumstances, improving mental function across the board.
From reducing anxiety to just enabling emotional regulation.
Let's look at how reframing touches both our deepest emotional struggles and, surprisingly, our most measurable cognitive processes.
Okay, let's start with a genuinely fascinating case study. Memory. Most people think of memory decline as a purely physical or, neurological thing.
Sure, it's about neurons and chemical balances.
Right. But this specific research offers a powerful psychological intervention.
That seems counterintuitive. How can changing your mind about your memory actually fix what feels like a physical decline?
Well, the study focused on individuals who were experiencing memory decline, whether it was perceived or actual. The crucial intervention was, in fact, psychological. The researchers recognized that many participants were suffering not just from memory challenges, but from these powerful negative control beliefs.
Control beliefs.
The belief that their problem was permanent, intractable, and purely biological. So the intervention involved teaching them that their memory could be improved simply by shifting their perspective on the problem.
So they weren't just, say, practicing recall exercises. They were fundamentally reframing the problem itself. Instead of seeing it as, I have a permanent, inevitable physical deficit, they were trained to adopt the frame. My memory challenges are manageable and subject to my own cognitive effort.
Precisely. That shift in the belief system, that is the core cognitive reframing intervention. It redefined their capacity for control. And the outcome wasn't subjective. It was measurable.
Really?
Yes. After receiving treatment based on this perspective shift, which focused heavily on altering those control beliefs, their memory performance demonstrably improved.
Wow. That just highlights the incredible link between our psychological framing and our physical or cognitive outcomes. They stopped labeling themselves as helpless victims of memory loss and started seeing themselves as active agents.
Capable of improving a malleable system.
The reframing was the catalyst that allowed their cognitive system to re-engage with training. It's the ultimate positive, self-fulfilling prophecy. It proves that belief can actually drive biology.
And moving from the cognitive to the profoundly emotional, our second case illustrates the essential relief that reframing can provide when you're navigating severe, sustained life challenges. The sources cite the example of parents with disabled children.
Which is, by definition, an experience that carries just immense logistical, financial, and emotional weight.
Absolutely.
And without intervention, the sheer weight of that ongoing situation can lead to deep negative thought patterns. Things like chronic grief, resentment, overwhelming stress, or even guilt.
Which can be harbored against the child, the experience, or their own perceived shortcomings.
Right.
The research confirmed that many parents struggled with these complex negative thoughts. So cognitive reframing techniques were used to help these parents shift their internal narrative.
Okay, so how does that work? Instead of viewing the situation through a relentless lens of burden or tragedy or loss?
The reframing technique allowed them to shift the meaning they assigned to their experiences.
That must be incredibly complex work, though. The tragedy or the difficulty of the disability doesn't just disappear. The child's needs don't change. So what exactly is the shift in perspective?
The shift is in finding meaning and growth within the challenge. It's moving the frame from, say, this is a cross I must bear, to this is an experience that has taught me profound resilience, or given me a unique bond, or defined a specific necessary purpose in my life.
So they began focusing on the unique strengths, the small triumphs, reframing the daily struggles as milestones in a unique journey.
It's an internal alchemy, really. The emotional cost of the situation gets reorganized, and the source material emphasizes that by shifting their perspective, the parents were able to manage their emotional landscape far more effectively. They often reported reductions in anxiety and depression.
Not because the situation changed.
But because the meaning assigned to the situation changed dramatically.
Which leads us to the most surprising finding in our sources, the connection between reframing and humor.
Yes. Humor, specifically positive humor, is a behavior that's been shown to actively facilitate cognitive reframing.
Okay, this is where we go from the deeply serious to the slightly more whimsical, but it's still scientifically critical. Why is the distinction of positive humor so important here?
Because not all humor facilitates growth. The sources are very specific about this. Mean-spirited humor, sarcasm, derogatory humor. That's often a form of negative reframing. You're shifting the perspective to diminish or attack someone else, usually confirming an existing negative bias.
Right.
We are talking about constructive, playful, self-deprecating, or genuinely lighthearted humor.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, the goal of positive humor is usually to create distance or diffuse tension, not to amplify negativity. Tell us about the study with the unpleasant pictures.
So the study was designed to measure emotional regulation. Participants were exposed to a series of, well, unpleasant, emotionally negative pictures.
Yeah.
And to cope with this negative emotional input, the participants were split into 3 groups. One group was invited to create a positive joke or a humorous observation about the picture. The second group was told to create a negative joke.
In the third?
The third was the control group. They created no joke at all.
So the input was uniformly negative, and the variable was the conscious cognitive task you imposed on them.
Exactly. And the results were stark and immediate. The participants who were tasked with creating a positive joke showed a clear, measurable emotional benefit. They tended to elicit positive emotions, or at least strongly neutralize the negative input.
And that was different from the other groups.
Very different, unlike those who created negative jokes, or notably those who created no joke at all.
So the act of actively searching for a positive, lighthearted perspective in the face of something unpleasant is what regulates the emotion.
Yes, it's the cognitive demand of the joke search that matters.
So how did the researchers synthesize this finding?
Well, the authors of the study concluded that positive humor epitomizes a rapid variant of cognitive reframing. And why? Because to make a positive joke, the individual must consciously shift their frame of reference, their perspective of an unfavorable event,
The picture.
towards a benign or absurd or more positive outlook of the same circumstance.
They aren't denying the negativity, they are mentally creating space from it. That sounds a lot like the concept of psychological distancing that you see in the literature.
It's very connected. Psychological distance is the ability to mentally remove yourself from a situation so you can observe it neutrally, rather than being fully immersed in the emotional reaction.
And positive humor is just a quick self-administered way to get that distance.
It is. It forces your brain to engage in mental flexibility, to see the world from a lighter, safer angle. And that conscious cognitive shift is what instantaneously regulates the resulting emotion.
That's incredibly practical. It means positive humor isn't just entertainment. It's like a mini session of psychological distance training. You use the unpleasant image as a prompt, but the joke becomes the new reframed reality that your emotional brain responds to.
Whether you are reframing your perceived memory limitations, finding meaning in parenting a child with profound needs, or, generating a joke about a stressful meeting, the mechanism is the same. You identify the initial limiting frame, and you actively replace it with a more constructive, positive, or flexible one.
And humor is just a rapid, socially accessible method for doing exactly that.
Precisely.
All right, now we come to the section that I think provides the essential clarity that our listeners are here for. These three terms, reframing, restructuring, and distortion, they were so often used interchangeably in popular conversation.
They are.
But understanding their precise relationship is the key to mastering this whole concept.
You're absolutely right. And we should address you, the listener, directly here.
Yeah.
Because reframing is such a general term for almost any shift in perspective, conscious or subconscious. It inherently overlaps and causes confusion with cognitive restructuring and distortion. We need to lock these distinctions down.
Okay, let's start by reinforcing the difference we established earlier. Distinction 1, reframing versus restructuring. Let's focus on direction and scope.
Okay. Cognitive reframing is the general, broad term. It refers to any generalized change in a person's mindset or viewpoint. And crucially, as we said, this shift can be positive, negative, or even neutral.
It's directionally indifferent.
Exactly. It is simply the action of changing the mental frame. It's the raw skill.
And cognitive restructuring.
That is the specific therapeutic application, the one pioneered by Beck. Restructuring is defined as the act of systematically, therapeutically changing one's dysfunctional mindset to specifically strengthen oneself and improve mental health.
Meaning that restructuring always, without exception, carries a clear, positive connotation.
Always. It is the systematic application of the skill aimed strictly at improvement and empowerment.
Okay, so if I spontaneously decide that missing my bus means I must have avoided a terrible accident, so I'm lucky, that's a simple, non-systematic instance of reframing.
Right.
But if I work with a counselor every week to identify a pattern of negative self-talk, and we systematically replace those thoughts with factual, balanced, positive statements about my self-worth, that dedication to positive, systematic change is cognitive restructuring.
Precisely. Restructuring is a particular positive, therapeutic instance of the broader reframing process. The difference is the intention, the structure, and that positive outcome goal.
Now we introduce the third term, which is the foundational problem that restructuring is designed to fix: cognitive distortion.
Right. And a distortion is not a process. It is a state. It's a pattern, an error in thinking. They define these as exaggerated, irrational, and typically negative thought patterns that are critically not supported by a rational thought process or external evidence.
These are the mental shortcuts that misfire.
They misfire, leading to illogical, disproportionate, and often deeply damaging conclusions.
And to give the learner some specific technical knowledge, we should probably go a bit deeper into what these distortions look like. What are some of the most common ways this flawed thinking shows up?
Well, the sources outline several common ones.
Okay.
You mentioned catastrophizing before, which is taking one small error or setback and immediately blowing it up into an extreme, total disaster.
Like, I spilled my coffee, so my presentation will be ruined and I'll be fired.
Exactly. That's a distortion.
Another extremely common one is all or nothing thinking, black and white thinking.
Yes, that's where you see everything in absolute terms. No middle ground. If you don't achieve perfect success, you see yourself as a total failure. It just eliminates all shades of gray.
And a third one that I think heavily influences our daily emotional state is emotional reasoning.
That's a powerful one.
Right.
It's believing that something is true simply because you feel it so strongly. I feel overwhelmed. Therefore, the situation must be overwhelming and impossible to solve.
It lets feelings dictate reality.
Instead of letting reality inform your feelings. And these distortions are so significant because, as the source material notes, they lead directly to negative results like chronic depression, anxiety, and just poor decisions.
So distortion is the target. Restructuring is the surgical, systematic solution to fix that target. And reframing is the overall generalized technique that restructuring uses.
That's the perfect hierarchy. If you find yourself in a state of cognitive distortion, your most effective path forward is the systematic, conscious, positive effort of restructuring.
We've established the direction and scope, but there's another major distinguishing feature, and that is awareness. When we engage in restructuring, we're necessarily aware of it, but what about reframing?
This is a critical point that differentiates the two. Cognitive restructuring, because it's a therapeutic, systematic technique, is always conscious. It requires the patient to recognize the distortion, articulate their frame of reference, and consciously, deliberately shift to a more positive one.
Usually under guidance.
Right. But since reframing is the generalized mental process, it doesn't always require that conscious decision. It can happen automatically, almost instantaneously, and completely subconsciously.
Okay. Since reframing just requires any mental frame shift, it can be an internal automatic mechanism that's triggered by a need for psychological protection or efficiency or comfort.
Absolutely.
Can you elaborate on the subconscious examples? The sources cited hindsight bias, the classic knew it all along phenomenon. How is that really reframing?
Hindsight bias is a prime example of subconscious reframing. It's a protective cognitive mechanism that happens after an event is over. We look back on past outcomes, whether we failed an exam, lost an investment, whatever it is.
And we unconsciously convince ourselves that the outcome was totally predictable.
We say things like, oh, it was obvious, or I knew it all along.
When the reality is that the outcome was anything but predictable at the time the decision was made.
Correct. And the act of convincing yourself the outcome was predictable is a reframing maneuver. You are subconsciously changing your frame of reference about your original knowledge or your decision-making process.
And the function is protective.
Entirely. If you made a bad decision, hindsight bias reframes the situation by suggesting the information was always there, or that the path was inevitable. And by doing this, you protect your ego and self-esteem from the full weight of responsibility for a poor choice.
And you often do it without ever realizing you've performed that cognitive shift. It's subtle, automatic, protective reframing.
Right. That perfectly illustrates a reframing that serves an internal psychological function automatically, without any conscious goal of being positive.
Which leads us to the final paradoxical element, the benefit of negative reframing.
Yeah.
We've overwhelmingly emphasized the positive outcomes of restructuring, but are there contexts where shifting into a negative frame is actually beneficial?
It definitely feels counterintuitive, right? Why would you ever consciously choose to frame something negatively? The sources use the excellent, clear example of a professional actor. In theater or film, an actor may need to appear sad, tragic, or inhabit a profoundly negative emotional state. They need to be externally dysphoric for the role.
And to achieve that deep performance state, they can't just pretend. They have to genuinely generate that emotion.
And they use the reframing mechanism consciously to alter their internal state of mind. They can induce that temporary negative emotional state.
So they're actively reframing memories or hypothetical situations in a way that generates sadness or despair.
Exactly. Not because they want to suffer, but because the job requires temporary professional alignment with a negative emotional goal. It is a conscious, intentional use of reframing, but for a professionally required negative outcome. The goal is alignment, not personal destruction.
And finally, let's bring it back to the learner, the person processing complex information in the modern era. We live in a world where everyone is pushed toward polarization, forced to take a side.
And information is often filtered through these highly partisan emotional lenses.
This is perhaps the most important application of reframing outside of the clinic today. The source material notes that reframing can also be used to make one's viewpoints purely objective.
This is the conscious process of shifting your perspective to be neutral, balanced, and less polarized about a certain situation, particularly one that triggers strong opinions.
So this isn't about finding the silver lining or finding the negative outcome. It's about finding the factual, objective ground that exists outside of your immediate emotional or political reaction.
Exactly. When you consciously choose objectivity, you are reframing the situation from an us versus them conflict or a good versus evil binary to a data point versus data point analysis.
It's a deliberate shift away from the typical positive-negative binary and into that neutral space.
And that shift is essential. It allows for more rational thought, better integration of conflicting data, and ultimately better decision-making when you're processing complex, real-world information.
That was a tremendous, clarifying deep dive into the architecture of perspective. To summarize our key takeaways, We trace the concept back to Aaron T. Beck in the 1960s, showing that the systematic power to change our thoughts to combat serious issues like depression, which he termed cognitive restructuring, is real and therapeutic. We saw the profound functional power of perspective shifts, not just for heavy emotional burdens like coping with chronic life challenges, but for improving actual cognitive function, like enhancing memory through altered control beliefs.
And we found a surprising immediate ally in this process: positive humor, which forces our minds to perform psychological distancing and conscious, lighthearted reframing of unfavorable events.
And most importantly, we clarified the vocabulary. Cognitive reframing is the general process, can be positive, negative, conscious, or subconscious. Cognitive restructuring is the specific, structured, conscious, therapeutic effort aimed always at strengthening and positive change.
And cognitive distortion represents the pattern of irrational, exaggerated thought, the target that restructuring is designed to eliminate.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the knowledge we gain today is most valuable when it's understood and applied systematically in your daily life. The power lies not just in automatically defaulting toward the positive, which is often our impulse,
But in understanding when the goal of objective neutrality is actually the most effective and rational shift.
every piece of information you receive, every challenging interaction you face, it all demands a frame of reference.
And you have the choice. You can let your frame be dictated by automatic, sometimes distorted, subconscious mental habits, or you can consciously and deliberately choose a new frame that serves your long-term goals.
That brings us to our final thought for you to chew on. Reflect on the difference between the impulse to positively reframe a challenging event, say, turning a severe business failure into just a learning experience, versus the conscious choice to reframe that same event toward a neutral, objective perspective focused purely on data collection and rational future planning.
Which type of reframing do you rely on most in your daily information processing? And when is neutrality actually the most powerful act of self-improvement? Food for thought until our next deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a conflict that, well, it often gets just a paragraph in the history books.
If that.
Right. But it fundamentally, redrew the map of Europe for the entire 18th century. We are talking about the War of the Spanish Succession.
A brutal 13-year struggle from 1701 to 1714.
And you really can't understand the rise of Great Britain as this global power or the final limits of French power under Louis XIV without getting this war.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just some European skirmish. I mean, this was a sprawling global conflict. It was running at the same time as the Great Northern War in the Baltic, Queen Anne's War in North America.
So this was what, the first truly modern great power conflict?
I'd say so. Fought over strategic and, maybe more importantly, economic control.
And the whole thing kicked off because of one simple yet totally catastrophic event.
The death of Charles II of Spain in November 1700. We call it the problem of the empty throne.
Okay, so Charles II, he's the last Habsburg king of Spain. And he was sickly, weak, and most critically,
he was childless. And while Spain itself, its military, its internal structure was really struggling, the empire itself was still vast.
And when you say vast, we're not just talking about Spain.
Oh, not at all. You're talking about the Spanish Netherlands, which is modern-day Belgium. You're talking about huge, wealthy territories in Italy, Milan, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and of course,
But Americas.
the gigantic, immensely rich American empire from Mexico down through Peru, plus the Philippines. It was a global inheritance.
So if that entire empire fell into the hands of either the French House of Bourbon or the Austrian House of Habsburg, the European balance of power, it just shatters.
Instantly. So our mission today is to unpack this long, difficult, and ultimately transformative war.
Right. We need to understand how Europe, especially Britain and the Dutch Republic, fought for over a decade to stop the union of the Spanish Empire with either France
Where Louis XIV's grandson, Philip of Anjou, was the candidate.
or Austria, with the Habsburg Archduke Charles as their guy. It was a war fought for balance, not really for conquest.
And the fascinating thing is, everyone saw this coming.
It wasn't a surprise at all.
No. The great powers had been anticipating the succession crisis and, frankly, scheming over how to carve up the spoils for decades.
Okay, so let's unpack that, the whole dynastic crisis, because it really shows just the utter failure of diplomacy before the war.
It does. Louis XIV of France and William III of England, they tried desperately to solve this peacefully.
By carving up the Spanish Empire themselves.
Before Charles II even died. And a key detail here, they completely excluded the Spanish government from the process.
So Spain had zero say in the fate of its own empire.
None. The first big attempt was the 1698 Treaty of The Hague, and the heir they landed on was Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, a 5-year-old child.
The idea of being a kid from Bavaria isn't a threat to anyone.
Exactly. France and Austria would get some bits and pieces on the side as compensation. It seemed like a neat solution.
But then history throws a curveball.
A very cruel one. Joseph Ferdinand dies just a year later in 1699. Smallpox.
So all those careful calculations, all the backroom deals, gone. Just like that.
Which forced them to try again. This is the 1700 Treaty of London, and this one was even more detailed and even more of a mess.
So who was the heir this time?
This time they designated the Austrian candidate, Archduke Charles. But, and this is a huge but, Louis XIV insisted on massive territorial compensation for France, especially in Italy.
What was he after in Italy?
He was eyeing Naples and Sicily. Major prizes that would give France huge leverage in the Mediterranean.
But the Austrians weren't having it.
No, neither Emperor Leopold nor Archduke Charles would agree to the split. They felt they were entitled to the whole Spanish inheritance, and any division was, frankly, an insult.
So the Treaty of London was basically pointless before the ink was even dry.
Completely pointless. Which brings us back to the dying king himself. With all the diplomacy in ruins, Charles II had to make the final call.
And his council in Madrid had some advice.
They convinced him that the only way to keep the empire in one piece was to give it to a power strong enough to defend it. And that power was France.
So Charles II's final will names Louis XIV's grandson, Philip, Duke of Anjou, as his sole heir.
With one absolute condition.
Philip had to renounce any claim to the French throne.
Exactly. So in November 1700, he's proclaimed Philip V of Spain. Louis XIV got what he wanted, seemingly without firing a shot. The crisis should have been over.
But it wasn't. This is where Louis's, staggering overconfidence just makes war inevitable.
He immediately put Bourbon power ahead of European peace. We can point to 3 specific fatal provocations that basically guaranteed a new Grand Alliance would form against him.
The first one being symbolic, but hugely important.
Louis registered Philip's claim to the French throne with the Parlement of Paris.
Which completely violates the will.
It completely violates the will. Even though Philip was only 3rd in line, it terrified Europe. It explicitly raised the threat of the French and Spanish crowns uniting, creating a universal monarchy, the very thing everyone was trying to prevent.
Provocation number 2 was military.
Yes, aimed right at Austria. French troops quickly moved in and occupied the Spanish-controlled Duchy of Milan and allied Mantua in northern Italy. This basically forced Emperor Leopold's hand. He had to fight for Italy now, no matter what.
And the third one hit the maritime powers, Britain and the Dutch, where it hurt, their commercial and strategic interests.
In the Low Countries, this is the issue of the barrier fortresses.
Right. After the last war, the Dutch had the right to put their own soldiers in key forts in the Spanish Netherlands to protect their border.
And Louis just sent in French troops to kick them out. He replaced the Dutch garrisons.
It's a massive insult, diplomatically and militarily.
It's huge. It removes the buffer zone protecting the Dutch Republic. And even worse, now France controls that whole coastline, including ports like Antwerp and Ostend. That threatens the Dutch trade monopoly on the Scheldt River.
And gives France a perfect launch pad for an invasion of England.
Precisely. So you have this triple threat: a dynastic threat, a military threat to Austria, and a strategic and commercial threat to the maritime powers. War was now a certainty.
So the response is the Treaty of The Hague in September 1701. The old Grand Alliance is back.
Leopold, the Dutch Republic, and Britain. But even then, they weren't explicitly demanding Archduke Charles be king. Not yet.
But then Louis makes one final mistake.
The final trigger, at least for Britain. The exiled Catholic king, James II of England, dies in France. And Louis reneges on his earlier promise to recognize William III and publicly declares Jones's son the rightful king of England.
You just don't touch the Protestant succession in Britain. That is the absolute red line.
And that was it. William died soon after, but his successor, Queen Anne, was fully committed. The Dutch declared war in May 1702, Britain and the Emperor followed a week later. The conflict was on.
So now that we have the trigger events, we need to talk about the deeper strategic drivers. I mean, why were Britain and the Dutch willing to basically bankrupt themselves over who sat on a throne in Madrid?
The simple answer is economics. This was the age of mercantilism, and for the statesmen of the time, the global economy was a zero-sum game.
So not a growing pie, but a fixed pie. And to get a bigger slice, you had to take it from someone else.
Exactly. State power was directly linked to accumulating gold and silver. And to do that, you had to maximize exports, minimize imports, and just ruthlessly attack the commerce of your rival.
We see that in the tariffs, right? You mentioned that English import duties on foreign goods went up by 400%.
An incredible number. And France banned English manufactured goods outright. So for the English and the Dutch, yeah, securing their borders was one goal. But the dominant economic goal was getting access to those huge Spanish markets in the Americas.
And keeping the French out.
And keeping the French out. That's why the conflict immediately goes global. The real prize wasn't Europe. It was the right to trade with Spain's American colonies.
Okay, let's look at the money, the finances of the powers, because you say this is where Britain had a sort of secret weapon.
It really was. France was, on paper, the most powerful state. Biggest population, strongest economy. But past wars had left it financially drained. Its tax system was a mess, inefficient.
And Britain's secret weapon wasn't more wealth, it was better financial tools.
It was financial innovation. The war cost an unprecedented amount of money, but Britain had already pioneered modern public debt. The creation of the Bank of England in 1694, the institutionalizing of a national debt. It all meant the government could borrow huge sums of money reliably and at lower interest rates than its enemies.
They were fighting the war on credit, essentially.
On future revenue, guaranteed by a stable financial system. While the French and Spanish systems were struggling with corruption and couldn't be trusted to pay people back, the British government could consistently raise the money to pay its allies and fund Marlborough's massive armies.
This financial strength was probably the single greatest long-term advantage the alliance had.
It really was.
Now let's turn to Spain itself, the prize of the war. You mentioned this paradox earlier. Bullion is pouring in from the Americas, but the state is bankrupt. Where was the money going?
It was a structural problem. That silver was basically spoken for before it even landed. It went straight to foreign bankers who'd financed Spain's previous wars, or it was absorbed by this huge, inefficient bureaucracy. There was almost no investment in the military or infrastructure.
So by 1701, Spain had, what, fewer than 15,000 troops?
It's a tiny navy. It was basically a hollow shell, an asset waiting for a more competent power to manage it.
Which brings us to the internal divide in Spain, which is crucial for how the war played out there.
Yes. You have to remember, Spain wasn't a unified country in the modern sense. It was a personal union between two crowns, the Crown of Castile and the Crown of Aragon.
And they had very different ideas about how Spain should be governed.
Totally different. The Castilian elite in Madrid, they saw centralized power, Bourbon-style reforms as the only way to save Spain, so they overwhelmingly backed Philip V.
But the Crown of Aragon, that's Catalonia, Valencia, and so on, they had their ancient privileges, the fueros.
These guaranteed them regional autonomy, their own courts, their own taxes. They were terrified that the French Bourbons, with their tradition of absolutism, would just erase all of that.
So for them, the Habsburg Archduke Charles was the better bet.
Much better. So when he landed, the Crown of Aragon became his strongest base of support. The war in Spain was as much a civil war between these two political cultures as it was an international conflict.
Let's move to the battlefield. The scale of this is just staggering. Armies in the Low Countries with over 120,000 men. I mean, how did pre-industrial economies even support that?
With immense difficulty. Logistics dictated everything. Campaigns followed the rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, because you simply couldn't move food and supplies for that many men and horses over land.
So the Bourbon armies had an advantage, being closer to home.
They had internal lines, yes. But the Allies could use their naval supremacy to supply their forces along the coasts and up those big rivers.
The war really kicks off in Italy, but the decisive shift comes in Germany. By 1704, the French and their Bavarian allies are planning a knockout blow.
A march down the Danube to capture Vienna and force Austria out of the war. It would have collapsed the Grand Alliance.
And to stop this, the Duke of Marlborough undertakes this this legendary march?
It's a masterpiece of strategy and logistics. He pretends he's going to attack in one place, gets the funds from the Dutch, and then, without telling anyone his real destination, he marches his army 250 miles across Germany in 5 weeks.
An incredible feat for the time.
And it completely wrong-footed the French. He links up with Prince Eugene of Savoy, and their combined army meets the Franco-Bavarian force at a little village called Blenheim.
And Blenheim wasn't just a victory, it was an annihilation.
Total. The Franco-Bavarian army lost over 30,000 men. It shattered Louis XIV's ambitions in Germany, it saved Vienna, and it forced Bavaria completely out of the war. The French were driven back across the Rhine and never seriously threatened Germany again.
And the momentum just keeps going. 1706, the Battle of Ramillies.
Another huge defeat for the French. After that, the Allies basically occupied the entire Spanish Netherlands in a couple of weeks. From that point on, France is on the defensive.
Meanwhile, what's happening in the south? In Italy?
Well, for Austria, Italy was always the main prize, even more so than Spain. The key moment there is when Savoy switches sides in 1703.
Why was that so important?
Because it opened up a new front against the French. In 1706, Prince Eugene wins a stunning victory at the Siege of Turin, and that basically ends French power in Italy. By 1707, it's pretty much all over there. The Habsburgs get Milan, Naples, and Sardinia.
And with the Mediterranean now secure, the British can focus on Spain itself and protecting their trade routes.
Yes, and they focus on strategic ports, not trying to conquer the whole country. The most famous example, of course, is the capture of Gibraltar in 1704.
Why was Gibraltar such a non-negotiable prize for Britain?
It gave the Royal Navy a permanent base right at the entrance to the Mediterranean. It's a perfect spot to refuel, repair, and project power. That was reinforced by the capture of Minorca in 1708, which had an even better deep-water harbor. These ports became absolute must-haves for the British.
But on the Spanish mainland itself, the war was just a frustrating slog for the Allies.
A total slog. Archduke Charles actually got into Madrid twice.
But he couldn't hold it.
He couldn't hold it. The Castilian population saw him as a foreign invader and stayed loyal to Philip V. The Allies just couldn't sustain their armies deep inside Spain, away from their naval supply lines.
So you could win the battles, but you couldn't win the peace.
Exactly. And the final nail in the coffin for Allied hopes in Spain was the Bourbon victory at Villaviciosa in late 1710. That battle confirmed Philip's control over the heartland of Spain for good.
So by 1708, the Grand Alliance has pretty much met all its original goals. France is contained, the Dutch border is secure, Britain controls the Med.
But that success made them overconfident. It led to what you could call mission creep.
And that overconfidence was fatal to making peace. By 1709, France is in a catastrophic position. Famine from the Great Frost, the financial system is collapsing. Louis XIV is desperate for peace.
So he opens negotiations. He's willing to give up almost everything.
But the Allies make one demand that is just so humiliating, so insulting, that Louis has to refuse.
They demand that Louis XIV must personally use the French army to remove his own grandson from the Spanish throne by force if Philip refuses to leave.
Wait, they're demanding he go to war with his own family?
Yes. And hand over key French fortresses as collateral first. Louis famously said that if he must fight, he'd rather fight his enemies than his own children.
So the arrogance of the Allies backfired.
Spectacularly. It allowed Louis to rally the French people who are now fighting not for conquest, but to defend France itself from destruction.
And at the same time, the Allies are feeling the strain. The Dutch are nearing bankruptcy.
And then history deals the ultimate wild card. An event that has nothing to do with the military, but changes everything.
In April 1711, Emperor Joseph I dies of smallpox.
And his brother and heir is?
Archduke Charles, the Allied candidate for the Spanish throne.
That's right. So Archduke Charles is now Holy Roman Emperor. If the Allies succeed in making him King of Spain too, they would recreate the massive Habsburg Empire of Charles V from the 16th century.
The very thing the war started to prevent. A universal monarchy.
Exactly. The entire strategic reason for the war just evaporated overnight for Britain and the Dutch. A Habsburg union was now just as dangerous as a Bourbon one. Peace became an immediate necessity.
And this happens to coincide with a change in government in Britain. The pro-peace Tories win the 1710 election.
The timing was perfect. The new British government starts secret negotiations with France, completely cutting out their allies.
So what were Britain's key demands in this separate peace?
They were very concrete. First, French acceptance of the separate crowns of France and Spain and the Protestant succession in Britain. Second, the permanent handover of Gibraltar and Minorca.
And third,
And third, and this is probably the most significant gain for the British Empire long term, a 30-year monopoly on the Asiento de Negros.
let's pause on that, the Asiento,
Yeah.
because this wasn't just some minor trade deal.
Oh, not at all. This was a fundamentally transformative commercial prize. And we have to be very clear, it was based on the horrific transatlantic slave trade,
It was the right to import enslaved Africans into the Spanish-American colonies.
a right formerly held by the French. Britain secured this exclusive 30-year monopoly, and the wealth it generated was immense. It led to the creation of the South Sea Company in Britain.
So this government-backed monopoly on human trafficking poured huge amounts of capital into the British economy.
It's a dark and undeniable foundation for the wealth that solidified Britain's commercial dominance for the next century.
While Britain is making its peace, the Austro-Dutch forces try to fight on.
But without British money and troops, it's hopeless. The French win a decisive victory at the Battle of Denain in 1712, and that convinces the Dutch it's over.
Which leads to the final peace treaty, the Peace of Utrecht in 1713. Philip V is confirmed as King of Spain, but on that one crucial condition.
He and his heirs must formally renounce any and all claim to the throne of France forever.
So the Peace of Utrecht is the mold that defines the new European order. It's remembered not just for the new borders, but for the core principle it established.
Now, that principle is right there in the treaty. It says that the same person should never become king of both kingdoms because of the great danger which threatened the liberty and safety of all Europe.
So it's the point where dynastic claims are officially made secondary to the balance of power.
Some historians see it as a key moment in the development of the idea of collective security and the modern nation-state.
Okay, so let's look at the final scoreboard. Who were the winners and losers?
Great Britain is the unambiguous winner. They get security, they get strategic naval bases in the Med, and through the Asiento, they seize commercial supremacy from the Dutch. And their financial system means they can actually manage the massive debt from the war.
What about France? Financially exhausted?
Exhausted, yes. But Louis XIV did achieve his main goal. A Bourbon is on the throne of Spain, and the Habsburg encirclement is broken, but the debt would cripple France for decades.
Austria fails to get Spain, but they get a lot of compensation closer to home.
They get the Spanish Netherlands, which become the Austrian Netherlands, and they establish dominance in Italy with Milan and Naples. They pivot to becoming a Central European power.
And the Dutch Republic, they get their border fortresses, which was their main goal.
They do, but the war leaves them bankrupt. They survived, but Britain permanently replaced them as the world's leading commercial and maritime power. They were eclipsed.
And finally, what about Spain itself? What was the legacy of Philip V's victory?
It was a legacy of centralization. Philip rewarded Castile for its loyalty and punished Aragon for its disloyalty. He issued the Nueva Planta decrees.
And these decrees just abolished all those old regional privileges, the fueros.
Wiped them out. He dismantled the old decentralized Habsburg system and created a truly centralized administration run from Madrid.
So even though Spain lost its European territories, internally, it actually became a stronger, more coherent kingdom.
Much more so. And it kept its massive American empire. It survived, independent, just now allied with France.
So this deep dive really shows that the War of the Spanish Succession was so much more than a family squabble over a crown. It was the moment the boundaries of European power were set, prioritizing national and commercial interest over who was related to whom.
And in doing that, it created the perfect conditions for British naval and commercial supremacy, a supremacy that would define global geopolitics for the entire 18th century. It created an economic gap that France just could not close.
And that commercial supremacy, as we've talked about, was cemented by the Asiento de Negros, the right to traffic enslaved people across the Atlantic.
It's a powerful and very sobering final takeaway. The stability of the European balance of power, the security of Britain, the whole modern state framework that comes out of Utrecht.
It rests on a foundation built with this horrific commercial engine.
It certainly raises an important question for you to reflect on. When we study these grand strategic victories, the balance of power, how often do we fail to account for the hidden immoral costs, like the Asiento, that truly financed and forged the world that came next? Something to consider as you think about this massive, formative conflict. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take on complex, often confusing topics and really try to provide you with the essential, synthesized knowledge.
And today we're definitely diving into one of those.
We are. We're strapping on our analytical goggles and turning our attention to a therapy that is, well, it's often lumped in with everything from legitimate physical therapy to, let's be honest, outright quackery.
That's a good way to put it.
We're talking about low-level laser therapy.
It occupies a truly unique space in the medical world, and for our mission today, we're going to dive into the stack of sources to figure out what you, the listener, really need to know about this.
Right.
This treatment uses light to stimulate the body. We're going to look at its incredibly specific mechanism, its wide-ranging and sometimes controversial claims, and most importantly,
The reality.
the hard-nosed reality of the current scientific evidence, and of course the regulation around it.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is this light therapy, and how are we defining its power level? Because when most people hear laser, they're thinking of something that cuts or cauterizes or burns.
Yeah.
This is the opposite, right?
Precisely. We're dealing with LLLT, which is commonly called cold laser therapy. For that very reason, it generates no destructive heat.
Okay, cold laser.
But the term the scientific community is now coalescing around, just to avoid all this confusion, is photobiomodulation,
Photobiomodulation.
or PBM for short. It's really the most descriptive name. It just means light
Thank
on
you.
influencing biological processes of biomodulation.
Right.
So PBM involves applying low-power lasers or even light-emitting diode LEDs to the body's surface. The light is specifically chosen to be absorbed by tissues without causing any thermal damage.
And the claim is what?
The proponents claim this stimulates healing, it can reduce inflammation, and it can relieve pain.
So the fundamental idea is that specific light at a specific power is triggering a biological reaction. That sounds less like a simple treatment and more like a photochemistry experiment happening inside the body.
That is the perfect way to frame it. It is entirely dependent on physics and chemistry working together in a very, very precise way.
Meaning, if you miss the mark.
If you miss the dosage, you miss the effect entirely.
I think the biggest hurdle for listeners accepting PBM as legitimate is understanding the engine room. How does light, without any heat, initiate these profound biological changes? It feels counterintuitive.
It does.
How does a specific wavelength of light actually kickstart our cellular machinery?
It's not magic, it's just the laws of physics operating at a cellular level.
Yeah.
It all begins with the most fundamental rule of photochemistry, which is the Grothus-Draper law.
Okay.
This law dictates that for a photochemical reaction to take place, light must be absorbed by a chemical substance.
So if it's not absorbed, nothing happens.
Nothing. It just passes right through, no reaction occurs.
So we need a specific light-sensitive receptor inside our cells. That's the target. What is that target in the context of photobiomodulation?
In the case of PBM, the crucial chemical substance that's absorbing the light is a respiratory enzyme called cytochrome C oxidase.
Cytochrome C oxidase. That sounds deeply important. And if my high school biology memory is serving me correctly, that's connected to the cellular power grid.
It is.
Where do we find it, and why is it the ideal target for light?
You are absolutely right. It is located inside the mitochondria, the literal powerhouses of the cell.
Okay.
And cytochrome C oxidase is the terminal enzyme in what's called the electron transport chain, which is this complex four-stage process that generates ATP.
Cellular energy.
Cellular energy, exactly. Now, here's the fascinating detail. The reason this enzyme is the perfect target is that when a cell is under stress from an injury or inflammation or disease, its efficiency just drops.
And why does it drop?
It drops because a molecule called nitric oxide NO preferentially binds to the cytochrome C oxidase, and it temporarily blocks the site where oxygen should be binding.
So the nitric oxide is essentially hitting the cellular handbrake. The cell is metaphorically running low on power because its key enzyme is tied up.
Exactly. It's gumming up the works. So when you shine the PBM light, typically in the red to near infrared spectrum, the energy, the photons, are absorbed by that enzyme.
Right.
And that absorption provides just enough energy to cause a little conformational change, which effectively breaks the weak bond between the enzyme and the nitric oxide.
So the light knocks the nitric oxide off.
It does. The NO is released, oxygen rushes back in, and the electron transport chain suddenly becomes much more efficient, leading to an immediate boost in ATP production.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So this boost in ATP means the cell now has the energy reserves to accelerate repair, fight inflammation, and divide more effectively. It's like the light is acting as a rapid, localized detoxifier and supercharger all at once.
That's a great analogy. And that rapid release of nitric oxide also has secondary effects that help explain some of the clinical benefits we see.
Like such as?
Nitric oxide is a potent local vasodilator.
Meaning it widens blood vessels.
Right, so once it's released from the mitochondria, it helps increase localized blood flow. That brings more oxygen and more nutrients to the injured area, and it helps flush out metabolic waste products. This is key to explaining the anti-inflammatory and pain-reducing effects that are so often reported.
So the mechanism seems sound. It's physics and biochemistry. Light frees up the enzyme, boosts power with ATP, and increases local blood flow through the NO release. But if this is so straightforward, why is the dosage so critical? You said earlier that too little is useless, but too much can be actively harmful.
This is probably the single most critical concept in all of photobiomodulation, and is why standardized research has been so challenging. It is governed by a phenomenon known as hormesis.
Hormesis. Okay, that sounds like a technical term we need to immediately translate for the listener.
Right. Hormesis describes a biphasic dose-response relationship.
Meaning?
Meaning, the response to a stimulus is dependent on the amount given. In simpler terms, a low dose provides a stimulating beneficial effect, while a really high dose provides an inhibitory or even damaging effect.
So like coffee. Too little, no effect. The right amount gives you a huge boost. Too much, and you crash and feel terrible.
Precisely. We can even tie it back to an older, semi-discredited but still relevant concept known as the Arndt-Schultz law.
Okay.
Which originally suggested that weak stimuli accelerate physiological activity, moderate stimuli inhibit it, and strong stimuli just abolish it. In PBM, the therapeutic window is astonishingly narrow. If you administer LLLT below the effective dose, the light isn't absorbed effectively enough to break that NO bond.
And nothing happens.
Nothing happens. The treatment is totally ineffective.
But if you go too high, if you overdo the energy dose, you risk causing damage. What's the mechanism of damage in that case?
The problem with excessive radiation is the overproduction of singlet oxygen and other highly reactive free radicals.
Reactive oxygen species, or ROS?
Exactly. And while a controlled, mild increase in ROS can sometimes be beneficial for cellular signaling, an excessive amount just overwhelms the cell's antioxidant defenses. This leads to oxidative stress, which can inhibit all the beneficial effects we just described, or worse, actually destroy healthy cells. Go from stimulating repair to causing cellular injury.
This means that PBM isn't just about owning a red light device. It's about having a device that delivers the right amount of energy at the right wavelength for the right amount of time, depending on how deep the target tissue is.
Absolutely.
I mean, that level of precision immediately clarifies why there's so much institutional skepticism, especially with how variable all the commercial devices are.
It makes protocol standardization extremely difficult. If one clinic uses a 10-joule dose and another uses a 1-joule dose for the exact same condition, they will inevitably get wildly different results.
And that makes a meta-analysis of all the research almost impossible.
It does. The dose needs to be strictly controlled by the clinician.
The idea of treating ailments with light feels ancient, but this modern, laser-based version is relatively new. Let's trace the historical path to PBM.
We have to start with the father of modern light therapy, the Faroese physician Niels Finsen. Back in the late 19th century, he was really pioneering the clinical use of specific wavelengths of light.
Right.
He famously used concentrated light from carbon arc lamps to treat skin conditions. His most noted success was using red light for smallpox lesions and phototherapy for a severe form of skin tuberculosis, lupus vulgaris.
And this wasn't just some interesting research on the side. He won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for this in 1903.
He did.
That is significant institutional validation for the power of light, even before the laser was invented.
It was a massive achievement. It highlighted that monochromatic light of a single color had powerful biological effects. However, as our sources note, the scientific evidence for some of his specific treatments is now lacking.
And then other things came along.
Exactly. Once antibiotics arrived in the mid-20th century and smallpox was eradicated, many of his phototherapies just became obsolete. But the principle that non-thermal light could induce healing, that was established.
The real breakthrough for low-level laser therapy, the PBM we're talking about today, couldn't happen until the invention of the laser itself in the early 1960s. And this is where that classic story of the accidental discovery comes in.
Yes, the key figure here is the Hungarian physician and surgeon, Andrei Mister. He was working in Budapest shortly after the ruby and helium neon lasers were invented. Mister was trying to replicate an experiment that suggested high-power lasers could reduce tumors in mice.
So he was aiming for a destructive effect, but fate intervened with a faulty machine.
Exactly. The laser Mister was using was underpowered. It was defective. He applied this low-power ruby laser to the tumor sites, expecting a destructive outcome, but it failed completely to affect the tumors.
But he noticed something else.
He was meticulous. He had shaved the mice to conduct the experiment, and he noticed that the hair grew back significantly faster and more densely on the areas that had been exposed to the faulty, low-power laser compared to the untreated control group.
A scientific oops moment that changed everything. Instead of tissue destruction, he witnessed tissue biostimulation.
He did. The acceleration of a natural biological process. It was an incredible accident.
When did he publish that?
He published those initial results in 1967. Mister recognized the potential immediately. He continued his work, showing accelerated wound healing in mice using a helium neon laser, which operates at a different, highly effective wavelength. By the 1970s, he was applying this low-level laser light to treat human skin ulcers with reported success. He dedicated the rest of his career to this field.
You know, the accidental nature of the discovery really emphasizes those tight tolerances we talked about. If his laser hadn't been faulty, he would have likely seen a destructive effect or maybe no effect at all, and LLT might not even exist today.
The low power status was the absolute key to unlocking the therapeutic effect. It demonstrated that biphasic dose response in real time. But this accidental discovery quickly led to a terminology crisis. Mister originally called it laser biostimulation.
And the terminology has been a mess ever since, which, again, is probably why the public is so skeptical. But let's clarify the evolution of these names for a second.
So Mister's term morphed into low-level laser therapy, or LLLT. Then, researchers realized they could get similar photochemical results using non-laser light sources, specifically light-emitting diodes LEDs.
Which are cheaper and broader.
Right. So it became low-level light therapy. But to resolve the constant confusion over what low-level even means, it's subjective. It means nothing in a physics sense without quantifying the dose. The preferred term today is photobiomodulation.
PBM.
PBM, or photobiomodulation therapy.
It's just the most accurate term. PBM refers to the process, the light-induced change, whether that light comes from a laser, an LED, or some combination. So, for you listening, if you hear LLLT, cold laser, or red light therapy, just remember you're dealing with PBM, and the key is always the delivered dose, not the source.
Exactly right.
We've established the mechanism. Light hitting the cellular engine room, freeing up energy production, increasing blood flow. If the mechanism is that fundamental to how cells function, it makes sense that researchers would, well, point this light at a massive array of conditions.
They have.
Let's look at the primary applications where PBM is studied.
The traditional, most heavily researched area is in musculoskeletal and pain management. So LLLT or PBM is used for localized pain conditions like carpal tunnel syndrome, chronic low back pain, tendinopathy, and chronic joint disorders.
Like arthritis.
Notably osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis, yes.
And what does the clinical research consensus look like for these really common chronic pain conditions? We know the evidence is mixed, but why?
The mixed evidence comes directly from that lack of standardization we talked about. A Cochrane review on neck pain, for example. It often comes with warnings about a high risk of bias in the studies. The protocols were inconsistent, control groups were poorly chosen, that kind of thing.
But we are seeing better data for some things.
We are. We're seeing stronger data emerge for specific, targeted conditions. Recent systematic reviews suggest PBM can provide meaningful short to medium-term pain reduction in osteoarthritis. For conditions like plantar fasciitis, the evidence is growing to support short-term benefit, specifically around pain and function.
But if we look at more diffuse pain, like non-specific chronic low back pain or fibromyalgia, the evidence is still insufficient or highly questionable. It seems like the more targeted the pain, the better the result.
That seems to be the trend. And the most robust evidence, the gold standard where PBM really shines and is even covered by some insurers, is actually in prevention.
Now, this is a critical takeaway for the listener. PBM isn't just about curing old problems. Sometimes it's about stopping new ones from starting.
Absolutely. LLLT is highly effective for preventing and treating oral mucositis.
Okay, what is that?
It's a devastating side effect of chemotherapy where patients get these painful inflammation and ulcers in their mouth and throat. PBM, when it's applied correctly, significantly mitigates this suffering in patients undergoing stem cell transplants and chemotherapy.
And that's an area with solid evidence.
This is one of the few areas with high-quality, reproducible evidence, which is what leads to institutional acceptance.
Speaking of high-quality evidence, let's look at the commercial crossover points. The market for treating hair loss with PBM, specifically androgenetic alopecia, is huge. Is that just slick marketing, or is there real science behind it?
There is definite science there. PBM has been shown to increase hair density and growth in both men and women.
And what's the mechanism for that?
The proposed mechanism is that the light stimulates the dermal papilla cells, which prolongs the anagen, or the growth phase, of the hair follicle.
And how does it stack up against traditional treatments?
Recent reviews of numerous clinical trials suggest that PBM, when used consistently, can be comparable in efficacy to established therapies like topical minoxidil or oral finasteride, but without the systemic side effects.
But there's a caveat.
Always a caveat. The big one here is that long-term, large-scale randomized controlled trials are still necessary to fully integrate it into standard care. But the short-term evidence is undeniably promising.
And beyond hair, the application for chronic wound healing and even stimulating stem cells seems like a massive area ongoing research. I mean, if the mitochondria get a boost, the regenerative process should accelerate.
That's the theory, but the ability of the light to actually reach the target tissue is the great physical hurdle. And this brings us directly to the current hype application: brain stimulation or transcranial PBM.
Right, TPBM. The idea of using light to stimulate neurons for conditions like depression, trauma, or cognitive enhancement sounds revolutionary, but the skull is not transparent. We have to talk about penetration depth here.
We must. For PBM to work on the brain, the photons have to get through the scalp, the skull, and the meninges to reach the brain tissue underneath. This is where the physics of wavelength selection becomes paramount.
So not all light is created equal for this task.
Not at all. Visible red light, say 650 nanometers, and light from typical LEDs, they penetrate very, very poorly.
How poorly are we talking? We're fighting two major physical enemies here: absorption and scattering.
Correct. When light hits tissue, two things happen. It gets absorbed by things like melanin or hemoglobin, or it gets scattered. It just bounces off structures like collagen fibers. Red light is highly absorbed by hemoglobin in the blood, so very little of it even gets past the scalp.
So our sources say, what? It can only penetrate 0.0017 millimeters to maybe 5 millimeters?
At most. So for most consumer red light devices, the therapeutic effect is limited entirely to the skin and maybe some very superficial muscles.
Okay, so what's the solution for getting deeper?
To penetrate deeper tissues, especially the skull, researchers have to turn to near-infrared light, or NIR, typically 810 nanometers, 940, or 980.
And why is NIR the key?
Because it's much less absorbed by water, melanin, and hemoglobin. This increased transmission allows a tiny fraction of the light to reach deeper targets.
So if someone's trying to use PBM for something like cognitive function, they absolutely must be using a powerful, specific NIR laser, not just a red LED panel from the internet.
That is the minimum requirement for even attempting to reach the brain. And even with NIR, the amount of light that actually reaches 5 millimeters is dramatically reduced.
And then you run into the dosing problem again.
You do. The challenge becomes, if you boost the power of the NIR light to ensure enough penetration, you risk hitting that damaging high-dose side of the hormesis curve in the superficial layers. The delivery has to be sophisticated, using pulsed light or specific high-fluence, short-duration applications to ensure safety while still getting depth.
This complexity explains why PBM and neuromodulation is still considered highly experimental, despite some of the intriguing results being published. It's a frontier where you're fighting physics, optics, and biochemistry all at once.
It is. And just to close out the applications, these challenges extend to veterinary medicine. Lots of clinics use cold lasers on dogs and cats for chronic pain like arthritis.
Sure.
And while the desire to help is clear, the Evidence-Based Veterinary Medicine Association highlights that the research there is sparse and generally of low quality. So again, the mechanism is sound, but the clinical proof for routine use remains insufficient, whether you're talking about humans or animals.
This segment is essential for you, the listener. We've established that PBM has a strong theoretical mechanism and a handful of promising, very specific applications, like oral mucositis prevention and hair loss. But the market is just flooded with devices making wild claims.
It is.
We need to talk about the commercial reality and how to navigate the regulatory landscape.
Understanding the regulatory framework is paramount, especially in the U.S., where the FDA plays a major role. First, let's talk safety. PBM is generally considered safe when it's used correctly. Side effects are mild, maybe some temporary pain or skin irritation.
And eye protection.
Eye protection is often required, especially for the high-fluence laser devices. And as always, anyone considering home use for a skin condition must consult a dermatologist because skin type, race, and ethnicity all affect light absorption and therefore efficacy.
But the real danger isn't the device itself. It's the claims made about the device. We need to clearly define the regulatory difference between an FDA-cleared device and an FDA-approved device. This is the difference between legitimacy and fraud.
This is a critical distinction that trips up so many people. An FDA-cleared device, usually under the 500K pathway, means the manufacturer has proven their device is safe and substantially equivalent to a device already on the market.
A predicate device.
Right. It clears the device for market sale for a general purpose, like temporary pain relief.
Yeah.
But this clearance does not mean the FDA has rigorously tested and approved the manufacturer's specific claims of efficacy.
So a company can sell a laser device that's cleared for temporary minor pain relief, but if they start advertising that it cures cancer or diabetes, they have crossed a very serious line.
Exactly. FDA approval, which is the pre-market approval or PMA pathway, is reserved for high-risk devices or devices making really novel claims. Approval requires the manufacturer to submit rigorous, long-term, large-scale clinical trial data, proving the device is both safe and effective for a specific medical indication.
And LLT devices rarely go through that.
They rarely go through PMA for broad claims. The fraudulent companies deliberately conflate clearance with approval.
And that leads us to the spectacular and, frankly, terrifying example of the Q-laser PMA scandal. This serves as a massive warning sign for the listener.
It is the ultimate example of marketing fraud in this sector.
True.
In 2014, the FDA filed a complaint against Q-laser PMA because their devices, marketed primarily to home users, claimed to treat a staggering list of conditions.
How many?
Over 200 different diseases and disorders.
And these weren't just vague claims about pain relief.
No. They falsely claimed efficacy against the most severe, life-threatening conditions. We're talking cancer, HIV/AIDS, cardiac arrest, deafness, diabetes. It was an outright criminal attempt to profit off vulnerable people using unproven technology.
The government response had to be swift and severe. What happened to them?
The FDA secured a permanent injunction in 2015, which immediately halted the manufacture, marketing, and sale of the devices. But the legal fallout escalated. The owner, Robert Lytle, and several distributors were charged with criminal conspiracy to commit fraud.
And the outcome?
In 2018, Lytle was sentenced to 12 years in prison in order to pay millions in restitution. The severity of that sentence really reflects how dangerous these unsubstantiated claims are, especially when they lead people to abandon proven medical care.
That story is crucial. If a PBM device claims to treat more than a few specific, narrowly defined conditions like osteoarthritis pain or oral mucositis prevention, that is the biggest red flag imaginable.
It compels the listener to demand precision. And this history of fraudulent overstatement, combined with the methodological flaws in the broader research, is what keeps the institutional gates locked.
And that institutional skepticism is most clearly reflected in insurance reimbursement. If the science were overwhelming, coverage would be automatic, but the reality is the opposite.
It's the most telling indicator of where the evidence truly stands. Major payers remain deeply skeptical of LLOT for broad applications. For instance, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, and Aetna generally only provide coverage for that one single high-evidence application we talked about.
Oral mucositis prevention.
The prevention of oral mucositis in specific chemotherapy patients. That's it.
That's the one institutionalized area of trust.
Beyond that, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, currently does not provide coverage for LLT for any musculoskeletal or pain indication.
And what about others?
Perhaps the most explicit rejection comes from Cigna, one of the largest insurers. They list LLT as experimental, investigational, or unproven for any indication, with the occasional exception for mucositis prevention. And they support this position with detailed literature reviews that just demonstrate mixed results and a high risk of bias.
So what does this all mean? We have a therapy with a fascinating and sound theoretical mechanism, the mitochondrial boost via nitric oxide release, some promising, highly targeted uses, but a huge history of overselling, catastrophic criminal fraud, and, critically, very limited institutional buy-in from major medical payers.
It means that photobiomodulation is a technology that demands critical thinking. It is caught in this tension between a strong basic science foundation and these huge clinical application hurdles. It's primarily related to dosage complexity, that hormesis curve, and a long history of poor, non-standardized research protocols that have eroded trust.
So what's the path forward?
For PBM to move into the mainstream, it needs standardized, large-scale clinical trials that precisely define the dose and the wavelengths for every single claim.
We've taken a truly deep dive today, moving from the Grothes-Draper law defining the power of light, all the way through Andre Mester's happy accident finding hair regrowth on mice, to the crucial understanding of that narrow therapeutic window governed by hormesis.
It's a lot to cover.
It is, and the tension is clear. PBM is rooted in real photochemical principles. It boasts a few areas of tentative promise, hair loss, specific joint pain, but its generalized application remains highly scrutinized due to mixed research quality and a history tainted by extreme fraudulent marketing.
So the synthesis point for you, the learner, is absolute precision. Not all light therapy is equal. You have to ask about the specific wavelength. Is it red? Is it NIR? You have to ask about the delivered dose, the fluence, and the precise application area.
And reject any device.
Reject any device that conflates FDA clearance with FDA approval for broad claims. PBM is the science of hitting a specific target inside a cell, and if the light is off by even a small amount, the entire effect is negated, or worse, potentially harmful.
It seems like the difference between LLLT being a fringe treatment and a mainstream medical tool hinges entirely on controlling that light to hit the target with perfect precision.
It does. Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the action spectrum for tissue regeneration consists of more than one wavelength, as some emerging research into cellular signaling suggests, does this mean that the future of successful photobiomodulation lies not in a single monochromatic laser, but in complex, multi-wavelength light cocktails tailored precisely to an individual patient's biology and their specific cellular needs?
Something to ponder as you critically evaluate the next red light panel ad you see. Until next time, keep digging.